And finally, actually, to get us started, I want to introduce Andrew Natsios, distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy here at Georgetown. He most recently headed the U.S. Agency for International Development. His stint is at USAID, and before that at World Vision, a large faith-based relief organization, and also as a veteran officer in the Military Reserve, give him a keen perspective from all aid sectors. He's also a consummate expert on Sudan and a former U.S. Special Envoy there. He's the author of 3 books, an alumnus of Georgetown and Harvard's Kennedy School. Andrew Natsios, the theme of what we're talking about here is, it seems to me, 3 C's, which is coherence, coordination, commitment to long-term rebuilding. And it's the subject, I understand, of your next book.
Yes, it is.
Go ahead. I think you're turned on. Oh, you did.
Okay. I'm writing a book on foreign aid because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what actually happens, how it happens, and what the constraints are in aid agencies, not just in the United States, but the World Bank, the UN, and European aid agencies as well. But anyway, what I thought I would do is sort of set the stage in some ways for this discussion by describing the system and how it evolved and what it is now, what its weaknesses and strengths are. The first is we have to make a distinction between humanitarian aid in a slow onset, fast onset disaster, or another way of describing it is a natural or man-made disaster. A natural disaster is a volcanic eruption, a storm, a earthquake, a flood. It can be a tsunami, as we had in Aceh. Some people would argue there is no such thing as a man-made a natural disaster. All disasters are man-made because if you build your buildings right, you can have the worst earthquake in world history and nothing will happen because the buildings will sustain the effects. In southern Sudan, there was a 7.9 earthquake, I remember, in the mid-90s when I was at World Vision. And 1 camel died and 2 people who were on the Nile River fell in and drowned. At the time, there were no buildings in southern Sudan to collapse, and so no one died. To be hurt in an earthquake, you really have to be in a building. If you're outside, it's a little unpleasant and unnerving, but you're likely not to be hurt in it. And so some experts say there are no natural disasters, they're all man-made. We could prepare for these disasters, but we don't for a variety of political reasons. There are also things that are clearly man-made disasters, like wars, like the spill we're having now in the Gulf, like the explosion in Bhopal in India many years ago. So there are industrial disasters there. The biggest factor in terms of people dying, we did a study, I ran the Disaster Relief Office, it's called OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at AID, 20 years ago, which has the lead under federal law for all US government international disaster response. And I asked the staff, we had records for 30 years of all disasters in the developing world, and it was very interesting. 70% of the deaths were in famines and wars. Not in earthquakes, not in volcanoes, and I said, well, that's where we should be spending our money, because that's actually an area we can save people. 88 to 94% of all of the deaths in an earthquake take place when the earthquake takes place, and unless you built the buildings right, there's nothing a relief agency can do about the event itself. All they can do is help afterwards. The international system has profoundly evolved in the last, since the end of the Cold War, basically, since the late 80s, early 90s. And the disaster architecture of the international disaster assistance has also evolved, and it's improved, but it's improving incrementally. It's a massive, very complex structure. Let me describe it very quickly to you, but the first is what the mission is. The mission is actually much clearer for disaster relief than it is long-term development, which is much more difficult and has higher failure rates. The metrics are very clear. There's an internationally accepted standard that if the death rates in an emergency are more than 1 death per 10,000 people per day, it's regarded as unacceptable. It needs response. Used to be 2, we've lowered it. The whole international response system is, collaboratively agreed to move it to 1. And I actually did a study of my hometown, a small, prosperous small town in Massachusetts, and the death rate from the town records was half a person a day. In other words, a person died every other day on average over a 5-year period. So this is double the normal rate of death in a wealthy, prosperous small town in New England. But the death rates in the camps in Darfur were 8 at one point. So it was 800% higher than the death rates allowable by international standards. So we have a standard in the Médecins Sans Frontières, International Medical Corps, the Center for Disease Control, AID, the World Health Organization, sets up monitoring systems. They're called surveillance systems, and they actually track what the death rates are in camp settings and in after disasters. So we actually track, because it tells us if the death rates don't go down or they go up, then it means something's wrong with the response system. The focus is on what are called clusters. And they're humanitarian clusters. We've been doing it for years, but it's formalized now. It's water and sanitation. The biggest killer in Haiti was not what we did with the rescue committees and all that. It's dirty water and communicable disease. Dirty water kills more children in third world countries, even when there's no disaster, than anything else. Diarrheal disease kills children. It's food and sanitation. It's shelter. It's emergency medical care. And it's rehabilitation. And there are standards that have been developed in the NGO community, in the UN, in the US, and in Europe. In the US, we call them the SPHERE standards. I chaired the committee at Interaction, the NGO consortium that dealt with these, or that developed these. And the fact is that these standards, we don't always follow them. That's the problem. There's no enforcement system except peer pressure. There is a focus, though, on these specific areas. Now you'll say, why don't we do schools? Well, that's in the rehabilitation and reconstruction phase. But in the response phase, we focus on these. What is the response system? Well, first, it's 4 big UN agencies. I actually would like to prohibit other UN agencies from getting, because too many actors mucks up the system. It can become very chaotic if too many people get involved. It's UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's UNICEF. It's the World Food Program, the 2 UN agencies that are most competent at this stuff are UNICEF, in my view at least, and the World Food Program. And also the United Nations Development Program. In wars, when there are human rights abuses, I think we should add in the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a new agency that's rather small. And there is a UN agency called OCHA, Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Assistance, and the Secretariat in New York City, that's supposed to coordinate all this. I say supposed to because a lot of these people don't want to be coordinated, these institutions. There are about 20 to 30 major NGOs that do work that actually have the capacity to make things happen. What you see on TV is hundreds sometimes of NGOs, but if you actually see how many people they have on the ground, how much money they're spending, what their programs are, it's really 30 NGOs that spend even more than 90% of the money, and actually have the systems in place to respond in a competent and quick way. And finally, there's the Red Cross movement. The International Committee of the Red Cross, under the Geneva Conventions, is the enforcing agent. They specialize in war zones. They do a very good job under very difficult circumstances. Now, my view is we should not be getting other actors involved in this, except in remarkable circumstances. Some people think the US military is involved in every disaster. There are 60 major disasters, I shouldn't say major or minor disasters a year in poor countries in the developing world that this system responds to. The military gets involved in maybe, the US military, European military, even local military, maybe in 3 a year, two a year. My experience when I was aid administrator was 1 a year. So they're not involved in most of these. Sometimes they are, depending on whether we need the logistics capacity. So some people are afraid the military's taking this all over. They're not taking it all over, and they don't actually, they volunteer to help if they can, but they're directing, they look like they're in charge in Haiti, frankly, because they have the command structure, and I was a civil affairs officer for 23 years, so it's the kind of work I did in the reserves. They do this when no one else is there in a massive disaster, like in the capital city in Haiti or in Aceh that President Bush sent, as President Obama did, the military in to help. Now, what are the problems with this system?